So you want to knit a gnome and you're new to knitting in the round. Well, I want to help you. Let's talk over a few things that you need to know about knitting in the round before we go to the videos about the specific techniques, the different kinds of needles. So, gnomes are interesting in that they have wide parts and they have skinny parts. And it's the skinny parts that cause us a little bit of a tricky problem with knitting in the round. If you've knit a hat in the round, you could probably, the way you knit it was probably on a 16-inch needle and just knit it all the way, for instance. Or if you knit a cowl in the round, you could knit the same needle all the way up without any problem because the circumference wasn't changing. But here you can see we're changing sizes, and so there's some things to know about, and we're going to be talking about the different needle types and some tips and tricks to know ahead of time. Before you knit your first gnome, I suggest just casting on 30 stitches and knitting in the round, maybe with a couple different needle types, and maybe you borrow them from your friend, or maybe your local yarn shop lets you do needle tastings. But try something first. Don't cast on, necessarily enough for a sock. If you're an experienced sock knitter, you're going to be fine. You know what you're doing. Although, if you're a sock knitter on 9-inch circulars, I have bad news for you. These don't work, and it's because gnomes get so very narrow in places. So, of the known knitting in the round methods that I know about, at least, this is the only one that won't work. You can't just use one 9-inch circular needle. So let's talk about the other kinds. You may have seen people using double pointed needles. There is a point on either end. So the yarn, you can start here and slide off here. There's nothing stopping it like with a flat needle. And you normally use groups of 4 or 5. You're only ever knitting from 2 needles at once. No matter how many needles are hanging off the back, you've still got the needle with the stitches you're currently working and the needle you're working them onto. Magic loop is pretty magical because I said that a small circumference needle wouldn't work, so how come a long circumference needle does? Well, magic loop is a really interesting technique, pretty magic, where you have the stitches split in 2 over half and half, or depending on the pattern, less evenly, and you slide one side out, bring it around, that's where the magic of the loop comes in, and you knit off the other one. Magic loop is a really interesting way to do it because you can knit a lot of things on a long needle that you can't knit on a short needle. In addition to magic loop, you can also use 2 really long needles. So what's that about? Well, that's the 2 circular methods, the 2 circular needles method, where you have half the stitches on each needle, and what you do is you only ever use one needle to knit half the stitches. So you'll have the stitches on one part and you will be using the same connected tip from the same connected cord to knit those off. And for that technique, you don't have to have really long needles. In fact, some people I know have used quite short needles, so you don't necessarily need to have very long ones. Some people have even told me they've tried it with the 9-inch circular needles. So if that's interesting to you, you might want to give that a try. Lastly, there are these things called FlexiFlips or flyers. 2 different companies make those, Haya and Addy. And they are a little bit like Magic Loop and a little bit like DPNs. They are 3 needles that look like DPNs but have a cord like a magic loop or like a circular needle in the center. And what that does is it allows you to work very much like magic loop in that everything is split over the 2 needles and you are working onto a 3rd, but the difference is that you don't have those big cords. That's a really quick overview of the different techniques that work. There will be videos that go into detail about those, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview to show you that there are other options and that you should definitely play around. If one of them makes your hand cramp, that might just be the technique, not knitting in the round. If it's making your hand cramp, don't do it for a really long time either. When I first taught myself to knit, I would often just do like 5 minutes at a time because my palm was cramping right here. I do want to take a moment to talk about different kinds of materials, because if you are struggling, it may be that your needles are too slippery. If you have a really slick metal needle and you are only using, let's say, 4 stitches per needle at the tippy top of something like this, the fact that it's slippery and there's very few stitches really can make it just like, you just feel like you're clumsy and you're terrible at this. And it might not be you, it might be your needle. So if you have a metal needle, try using a bamboo, wood, or these ones, for instance, are carbon fiber. Whether it's DPN or magic loop, you may find that changing your needle material will make a difference in how comfortable you are and how confidently you can work with those fewer stitches. One of the things you'll need to do when knitting a gnome is divide the stitches into sections. If you are knitting on DPNs, each section's stitches will be placed on a needle. And that's one way that DPNs are great, because it's just do one thing per needle. So if you have to do it 3 times around, you would have 3 needles working in a triangle, and each section would be worked identically. If you are using one of the other methods, you're going to need to place some kind of a marker in order to divide that space up. So if you need to divide the stitches into 3 sections, you're going to need some kind of a marker to demarcate, because you can't do an odd number of sections over the 2 needles 50-50. Most of my patterns have a little bit of help telling you roughly where you would be placing those markers. And I'm working to upgrade all of them as I go through and reknit everything this year in 2022. I have a bit of a confession to make. I don't actually place a beginning of round marker, even though every one of my patterns says to place a beginning of round marker. And the reason is that the cast on tail shows me where I'm knitting and where my beginning of round was. So either use the tail as a way to show that, or attach a removable stitch marker so that you can just kind of say, hey, here's the beginning of round. One of the things that can happen with knitting in the round is laddering. Now, laddering usually happens at the junction of 2 needles. If you have if it doesn't really matter what's happening, it's an easy thing to do, is just move where that junction is. So you get to the end of a needle, you knit 1 more stitch onto it, and then when you get to the next junction, you knit 1 more stitch onto that needle, and you're just constantly shifting where that junction is. So if it was a triangle, the triangle's always shifting a little bit around, for instance. But that doesn't always work, especially if we're working with shaping in a section. And so then there are 2 tips I have to give you. One is to try increasing or decreasing the number of junctions you have. So if you are knitting on DPNs and you have it over 3 stitches and you have 3 junctions, try adding a 4th needle, making it a square. Then would be what it would look like. You would have the stitches over 4, and you would have a 4th junction, because that changes the angle of the junction. Or go from 3 to 2, and by that I mean try using magic loop, the FlexiFlips, or 2 long circular needles, because sometimes that's the difference. So my first suggestion is to change the number of junctions of needles, and the second suggestion is to make sure that when you put your needle tip into the 2nd stitch of that needle. So I'm putting my right needle into the yarn on the 2nd stitch of this section. So I've knit 1, and most people work really hard to make that snug for their ladder, but what happens is when they go to knit the 2nd one, the 1st one loosens up. So pay attention when you put your needle into the 2nd stitch, then kind of tug things up, because that will snug up the 1st stitch, and then knit the 2nd stitch. And that should make a difference for you. That's another thing that a lot of people find works. The thing that most people struggle with the most in the round with gnomes is laddering in the reverse stockinette section of cables, or of this gnome, for instance. Some people find using the Norwegian purl style can help. Other people just wait for it to block and see if it blocks out. It's something I struggle with, and I haven't found a perfect solution, but just be known that it's not you. It's sort of a known problem, and there are ways to make it a little better, and I hope you find one that works best for you. Happy gnoming!